So today I am joined by Aleeza. Aleeza is a dietitian who hopefully is going to tell us a little bit more about herself in a moment. To start us off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself professionally, your background, your experiences, and what led you to specialise in eating disorders?
You and thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm a specialist eating disorders dietitian, and I did my master's in eating disorders at UCL and have been specializing in this field for over 12 years now, both
Wow.
within the, yeah, long time. I feel old saying that, both within the NHS and in private practice. And so I've been in my own private practice full time for the last 6 years. I guess what led me to,
Yeah, that's what I
so
wanted
yeah,
to
yeah,
ask is what kind of you thought that's the thing
nudged
I want to be
me.
doing as a dietitian.
Yes. So it's interesting because I don't have any lived experience of any eating disorder. In fact, I have had, thankfully, a lifetime healthy relationship with food, which I attribute to my mum, who brought me up as an intuitive eater.
Right.
And I think that, I have so many amazing memories as a child growing up where food was a way in which we connected. There was definitely an interest in health, and those messages were around honor your body, it's your only kind of forever home, that I think are still embedded to today. And I think a lot of the decisions that I make are very much linked to health, but also it's about socializing and connecting and a family culture. And so I think that
So it
I've
sounds
had a
like she struck a nice balance between like
yeah.
enjoy food, use it as part of connection, but also like be mindful about, nurturing your body.
100% specialized in eating disorders. So I get the most, pleasure of seeing people completely overhaul a really negative, poor relationship with food and also improve their health in the process.
In your work, how do you understand the relationship between food, feelings, and behavior rather than food just being about nutrition?
Food is never just about nutrition. I think we all eat for reasons other than just getting nutrients into our body. We eat for identity, we eat for enjoyment, we eat for connection, we eat for social reasons. I mean, there's so many different reasons why we make decisions to eat and how we go about making those decisions. I think that, when it comes to working with neurodivergent individuals, I think that there are all of those factors. And I think food sits as an intersection between sensory processing, emotional regulation, as well as biology and nutrition. And I think what's really important to kind of understand and be mindful of when working with neurodivergent individuals is that they process food in a very different way
Yeah,
because they've got sensitivities to certain tastes, textures, smells, temperatures, much beyond just a dislike for them. I've had patients who have real visceral responses to
yeah,
certain textures,
yeah.
which might cause anything from reflux, regurgitation, vomiting, nausea. And so it causes a tremendous amount of distress. And their refusal to eat certain foods is not them being difficult.
I think when neurodivergence is missed or not understood properly, people can end up getting a lot of labels that actually
Yeah,
aren't really reflexive of what is going on, or they
100%.
are forced perhaps to eat things that they're sensory adverse to, which isn't therapeutic, it's traumatic.
Absolutely. And I think we've got to understand that, um, not just looking at the nutritional intake from a nutrient point of view. We've got to ask the question, what role are these eating difficulties and behaviors playing for the individual? And so when I work with neurodivergent people, I don't look just through the lens of nutrition. I look through the lens of what are the difficulties and why are they doing it? And obviously help them to keep them safe
Yeah.
whilst also helping to improve their nutritional status.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for highlighting that because one of the things that I talk about quite a lot, certainly in some of the training I deliver, is actually thinking about the intersections and the interplay between cognitive style, sensory, emotional regulation,
Yeah.
physical differences, communication preferences, how all of those things factor in because even something like going out to eat a social meal, perhaps if you really struggle with certain lighting or noise
Yes, yes,
look like a refusal to maybe eat or want to go, but actually that environment isn't okay for somebody, as example. So,
yes.
it's really critical when we're thinking about helping people to sort of recover from eating disorders to factor in all of these things.
Absolutely.
My next question was actually going to be, when you're working with neurodivergent clients, what differences do you notice in how eating difficulties present compared to perhaps other people who aren't neurodivergent?
Yeah, so I think, somebody who's not neurodivergent might go to a dietitian because they want to achieve something like improve their the insulin, control or the glycemic control, prevent diabetes, improve their cholesterol, lose weight. And so they're asking for advice in terms of what food changes can they make to achieve a
Mm,
certain goal. And for them, they're able to adopt those changes and make swaps, and they just get on with it. But the picture's a bit more complex when we look at the neurodivergent individual because the food itself can be problematic because
mm.
of those sensory sensitivities that the person has. And so it's not just about, okay, why can't you do this? Try this new food, replace this with this, because that is a huge problem when they have such strong sensitivity to different textures, tastes, temperatures, flavors, food combinations, mixed meals, even things touching on a plate. So,
I have it in my home where even like one of my kids will eat bananas at school, but she won't eat bananas at home because
yes, yes,
bananas are a school food. They're
yes,
not home
a
food.
home food, yes. And so I think, the sensitivities often lead to rigidity, like which is basically what you're saying. It's sort of like they kind of box certain things together. Um, and they might, you know, rely on repetition in order to kind of feel safe.
But it makes sense when you've got a nervous system that thrives better with predictability, with
Will it say,
routine,
yes,
and you're also perhaps living in a world that feels unpredictable. And
yeah.
so, actually, if we look at actually some people's eating habits, they're about trying to regulate a nervous system.
It's about knowing how that food is going to be experienced in your body. And
Yeah,
if you know that that banana you've had before at school, it makes you feel safe, it doesn't have any kind of emotional or physical distress related to it, well, then that knowledge that you're going to have a banana at school every day actually feels very safe and very predictable. And if that routine is working for your daughter, I think that's brilliant.
yeah.
One of the other things actually that I come across with, particularly with fruits, in neurodivergent individuals, is that fruits can sometimes have different tastes and textures. Whether it's a
Squishy.
sweet variety, yes, is it squishy? Is it
And they've got
firm?
green flecks in it. So in our home, everyone examines the fruit, and fruit is something that is a struggle for many neurodivergent
Yes,
people because it's
yes,
just not consistent. So
exactly.
my workaround with some of it was freezing fruit.
Yes, that's a really good idea because it helps to keep it the same texture.
Yeah,
And so it is about, identifying what feels safe, what's the ideal texture that is most acceptable by the
yeah.
individual, and making that consistently available to them. Because if it does deviate in terms of those textures, smells, flavors, that food refusal is not them being fussy.
We've touched on this question already, which is how much do sensory sensitivities around taste, texture, smell, temperature influence eating patterns, particularly for autistic or ADHDers. Um, I don't know if you've got anything else to sort of add there, because I know we've kind of touched on it already.
Yeah, I mean, I think hugely. I think sensory processing is huge, both for, autistic patients and ADHD patients. I think that in the context of ADHD, sensory kind of processing can be a little bit different in the sense that I've seen ADHD patients actually go for textures that are very sensory stimulating.
Yeah,
So I might, I often have patients on my caseload. Many patients come to mind when I talk about this who would specifically go for spicy,
yeah,
crunchy, very kind of stimulating tastes because that helped them focus, concentrate. Um, and often I actually have students who say to me that when they've got that kind of stimulation, it helps them with their revision and their concentration. They kind of need to be
yeah.
chewing on something. And the spicy kind of snack is definitely something that does it for a lot of patients.
So I did a podcast with somebody a little while ago, and he's a solicitor, and one of the adaptations that she asks for in court is to be able to chew gum, because
Yes.
she says to the judge, "Please, can I chew chewing gum as an
Yeah.
accommodation? It helps me to focus."
Yeah.
And how food can be used, as you said, as a way to seek dopamine, to regulate, to be able to concentrate.
And also I think we've spoken about the sort of sensory processing of different tastes, textures, flavors, which is very common. But I think what's also important to understand is that neurodivergent people have interoception differences. And so a lot of my patients cannot actually signal hunger or signal fullness.
Would you mind
Or,
just explaining for anybody that doesn't know that word what interoception is?
so interoception is kind of a feeling, I call it like an eighth sense in terms of how you kind of check in with yourself and notice, are you hungry? Are you full? What are you sort of feeling? It might be different in the sense that they may not signal hunger through feeling a hollowness in their tummy or having kind of that awareness of rumbling, kind of noisy, bubbly kind of sounds. They might, not signal hunger until it's actually very late into that episode, and, end up, not being able to re-regulate because they've passed the point of, normal hunger. They've left it too long,
Yeah,
and, it affects them from an emotional point of view or extreme physical. So, in those individuals who struggle to identify what hunger is or to acknowledge that they're hungry or recognize that they're hungry, or sometimes, it's just unreliable in that one day they might be able to recognize hunger to some extent, but then the other day they just don't have any kind of signal of hunger.
well, I think that can also be linked to what it is that they're engaged in as well. So I know for myself, and I joke about it, sometimes if you think about it as a podcast or a shuffle,
Yeah.
sometimes you need to eat song plays, and other times if I'm hyper focused in on something,
Mm,
it's
yeah.
like body signals are totally overridden. It's been eight
Mm.
hours, and I look up and it's dark outside and I haven't been to the toilet.
Yes, exactly right. And so I think, when I have, individuals with ADHD who struggle with identifying hunger, they often sort of leave it too late. And then they also struggle with executive function, being able to sort of make a decision about what to eat and how to kind of get it on a plate.
Yeah,
And so when you're not recognizing hunger and you're leaving it too late to the point where you're actually starting to feel quite shaky and dizzy and
yeah,
feeling faint, those patients often rely on those kind of easy to open packaged snacks
yeah,
that are sort of spicy, crunchy, give that kind of sensory stimulation,
yeah.
which also eliminates the need to actually prepare a meal. So they kind of,
which
use
which in itself
immediately
is
available.
another, preparing a meal within
Yeah,
itself is another executive functioning task that when people are so
yeah,
depleted and so exhausted from their day, they've been masking, actually they get home and there's just like no energy, no capacity left.
100%. So they feel totally overwhelmed. They cannot sort of even contemplate what to have, let alone figure out how to access ingredients, cook it, put it on a plate.
Yeah,
And so it does often result in sort of something that's immediately available, and often it is those crunchy or sensory stimulating
yeah,
snacks. I see patients become almost binge eaters,
yeah,
because of that kind of process.
yeah. And then actually that can lead further into then restricting the next day because then they feel shame about what they've eaten and that they've
Yeah,
eaten. So then the next day they then, it starts becoming more into eating disorder territory in terms of body image related stuff because perhaps they've gained weight from doing that. So now they're trying to restrict the next day. And then of
yeah,
course that leads to them being really physically hungry on top of everything else. And, patterns can start being set up. The other thing I was thinking is that everyone's sensory profile is different, and we've spoken a lot about people being avoidant, but actually some autistic and ADHDers are also sensory seekers.
yes,
And I know certainly in my home, one of the things that happens at 7 o'clock every night is it's ice cream o'clock because
right,
7 o'clock every night, one of my kids likes to have really cold food.
yes,
It's
yes.
stimulating for her. She's a bit of a sensory seeker. Teens' predictability and safety can be regulating and protective for many neurodivergent people. How do you think about the difference between helpful structure and eating becoming perhaps rigid or restrictive?
Mm. I think routines can be very regulating and supportive and helpful, provided it is serving them in that way. So, I do have patients who, for example, don't signal hunger, but they know if they leave it too late, they are going to sort of have those faint symptoms or find it difficult to emotionally regulate. And so they find it really helpful to almost eat breakfast by the clock,
Yeah,
knowing, whether or not they're not hungry, they just know they're going to have breakfast before they go to school because that's filling their tank up with fuel that's going to allow them to get on with whatever they want to do in their day. And if they have safe food for breakfast that is consistent and predictable and enjoyable, it's fine to have the same breakfast because it helps to minimize distress at that time of the morning when everybody's rushed and needs to get
yeah,
out of the house. And so, if that routine is supportive of helping that individual meet the needs for their day nutritionally so that they can actually get on with their day with minimal distress, well, then I think that routine is actually very supportive and very beneficial, and we just keep it in,
I'm
right?
really pleased to hear you say that because, again, I think when we come from a one size fits all approach, which is we have people in eating disorder treatment, and we've decided that actually their anorexia is making them rigid and this, that, and the other. And one of the things we try to do is like, no, I want you to try eating breakfast at different times, or I want you to try
Yeah.
having different food and have a larger variety. Like, actually, that's really, really unhelpful for some people
Yes.
who have executive
Yes.
functioning differences, and it's not sustainable. I think, like you said, it's really important to identify, is this actually supporting someone around some of their neurodivergent differences, or is this actually about the eating disorder and this is harmful? Because I think people can be very, very quick to just assume because it looks like
Mm,
an anorexic thing, it is an anorexic thing.
exactly. And so, in contrast to that previous supportive routine that I kind of described, you're right. I think if somebody's routine is shrinking their ability and the rest of their life, then it's problematic. So I have had patients who would only have breakfast if they manage to get a specific bowl on the other side of town that may or may not have stock that they need to travel 2 hours to get to
Yeah,
and then still get on with their day. And it's causing a lot of distress as to whether they have it available,
yeah,
whether they're going to get there in time, whether they're going to make their meeting at work. That sort of rigidity is problematic in the sense that if it's causing such distress to have this routine of going to a place, picking up breakfast that may or may not be there, and it affecting the rest of their day,
what would
then I
you
think
do in
so.
that situation?
What I would do is I would keep that as an option for breakfast if it works for that person on some days.
Yeah,
And so on days where they don't have to rush to work for a meeting or it's a weekend day, but I think that it would be helpful to talk about a contingency plan.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Create maybe
if
a
that
coping
person,
routine.
yeah, yeah. So if
So
the routine,
you're not
you know,
removing the thing
no,
that
no,
helps
no, oh,
regulate
no,
them,
no, no.
but you're trying to branch out and build another routine as well.
Exactly. So we keep that routine because on some days it may work for them,
Yeah,
right? But we recognize that it's not working for them on other days. So how could we create a new routine on those time-pressured mornings so that they don't end up skipping breakfast and having the physical and emotional consequences of that?
yeah,
And it might be about figuring out what is the contingency plan, what might they have access to that also feels physically safe,
yeah,
doesn't cause emotional distress, that they
absolutely.
could have instead of that routine and all of the distress around it, and also instead of skipping the meal altogether.
So intuitive eating doesn't need adapting. It's quite often talked about as the gold standard within sort of eating disorder spaces, but is it realistic for everybody?
It has to be adapted 100%. So I do like the intuitive eating framework. It works for a lot of people. But it does require one to be able to tune in to your hunger signals and recognize when you are hungry, and then be able to feed yourself, and then also recognize when you are full. And so, yes, I think we could still use the framework, but it definitely needs to be adapted. And so, for example, what I do with, my neurodivergent patients is that we just bring in some external structure to help them with those interoception challenges. So, for
Such
example, I would say to a neurodivergent patient, if by 11 o'clock in the morning you haven't felt hungry to be able to eat, I think you need to eat anyway,
yeah,
right?
lovely.
Because we know that you would have been up for a good few hours. Your body needs fuel, just like a car needs to be topped up with some petrol in order to be able to drive you to a destination.
Yeah.
Your body needs fuel. And it may just not be able to signal to you that it needs that fuel, but you need the fuel anyway.
You perhaps suggest to a client, because it's one of the things that I sometimes do, that they set an alarm for 11 o'clock to help
Yes, exactly.
externalize things.
Yes, yes, yes. So we do a lot of reminders, alarms, kind of nudging them so that
Yeah,
if they actually aren't able to tune into their body themselves automatically, or their body is not reliably giving them those signals, then that structure in their day with that reminder will
yeah,
help them to actually nourish their body and actually uphold, the kind of
yeah,
ethos of intuitive eating, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. No,
And
I really like what you've said there about like giving space to see if someone can do the intuitive eating, but also adapting it and making it more workable. And I'm assuming that if actually over a period of time it's shown that actually maybe somebody just isn't going to be able to develop those signals, or it's going to continue to be difficult, you would just say it's fine, just keep using alarms or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever
100%.
that.
It's also just as useful for patients struggling with executive function. You know,
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think it works really well. And so, one of the other principles of intuitive eating is to, when you recognize you're hungry, make a spontaneous decision as to what you want to eat.
Yeah,
Now, that could feel completely overwhelming because they find it really difficult to figure out what they may want to eat, let alone be able to get the ingredients and prepare that dish. And so, instead of kind of having that spontaneity as a principle of intuitive eating, we just adapt it a little bit, where we kind of look at that ADHD patient's kind of routine, accessibility to food, and we just give them a bit of a short list
yeah.
of, instead of,
So
having, yes,
you
just
reduce
reduce.
the decision to make it, here are 5 options.
Exactly. So it's reducing, it's eliminating the overwhelm
Yeah,
around decision making, and it's just narrowing the focus and also giving them those foods that they know that they like,
yeah.
that's acceptable to them, but also, accessible as well. And often it's sort of those meal assembly on the plate kind of dishes that don't need sort of cooking and recipes and whatever. It's just that simple stuff.
All of these things are so important to take into account. And
Yeah.
it's like, I know even for myself, how my energy can sort of fluctuate and my capacity can fluctuate. And I know by Friday evening, when I've done a full week at work, pick the children up from school, the chances that I'm going to have the brain power to cook a meal is probably slim to none. So
Yeah.
Friday takeaway night,
Great.
and just building those things in and kind of
Yes.
setting myself up and therefore setting clients up to actually succeed. Misinterpretation and judgment. Many neurodivergent people are labelled as fussy, difficult,
Mm.
non-compliant around food. What do you wish that maybe other professionals understood a bit better about this?
They're not being fussy and they're not being difficult. I think it's a way in which they are communicating their needs to us. And I think they are refusing certain foods because they don't feel physically safe with them and they don't want to, become emotionally dysregulated. And so I think it's about being a little bit more curious and open-minded when it comes to looking at eating difficulties, and instead of kind of judging them and trying to, you know, convert a neurodivergent person into a neurotypical eater, I think it's about understanding, well, what does that behavior do and serve for them,
Yeah,
and and then helping them with that knowledge to become better nourished, but at the same time also upholding that kind of physical and emotional safety.
you've actually just kind of answered my next question, which is, what can people do? What can clinicians do to support eating difficulties without pathologizing neurodivergent ways of
Mm.
being or trying to force kind of like typical norms? I don't know if you've got
Yeah,
anything to add because I think you just covered it really nicely.
thank you. I mean, I think it is about working with their sensory difficulties and all of the other kind of neurodivergent traits as opposed to trying to change them or oppose them.
Yeah,
I think we have to just be mindful that it's serving a purpose and we've got to respect them,
yeah,
and then be creative around how we could make adjustments to the
yeah,
environment, for example, or what's put on the plate, or there's so many ways in which we can make amendments to help keep people emotionally regulated and physically safe, um, whilst still kind of respecting those sensory sensitivities and the fact that some
mm,
people just cannot, do the, executive function planning and shopping and preparing, and, that some people just cannot just, distinguish hunger and fullness. And so it's about helping them and guiding them and creating structure and, navigating around that in a way that, they still kind of feel like their needs are being met and they still
yeah,
feel safe with. And I think our language just needs to change. I think we need to just, instead of seeing people as non-compliant, treatment
yeah,
resistant, or
absolutely.
fussy or difficult, you know, I think we've got to, respect that, these eating difficulties are a way in which the person is trying to communicate to us their needs,
Yeah.
and we have to respect that.
Yeah, and that everyone is different. I mean, you know how passionately I feel about this area, having been somebody who struggled with an eating disorder from the age of sort of 10 years old, and thinking back to some of the labels that I was given, because I definitely had ARFID before I was anorexic, but always been told I was an incredibly fussy eater,
Yeah.
always kind of like struggled with things like sauces. Um,
Mm.
I actually have this memory of being in a restaurant with my family, and because I was known as quite fussy, they had actually given me food that was off. And I remember
Oh,
tasting it, and my parents like not believing me because they just thought I was being difficult and
difficult.
made
Oh
me eat
gosh, how
most of it.
awful.
And
No.
then, I mean, I don't blame them. They weren't know any different, but maybe eat most of it and then taste it afterwards, and someone goes, "Well, maybe that was." But equally, I know a lot of services have come, a long way, and we're lucky enough
Mm.
to work with some really, really great services. But there are still services out there, traumatizing people,
Yeah,
not doing people a service, and thinking back to some of my own experiences in eating disorder units where, yes, I absolutely was anorexic, but there was a huge sensory element for me and lots of other
mm,
factors. And, basically being told that, I was basically effectively going to be punished for not eating a certain thing, or if you refused to eat a certain thing, they would give it to you even more, as example. And
that's
then if you couldn't
awful.
eat it, you weren't allowed to see your family members or yeah, just sort of it's so important in eating disorder services these days to kind of like see the bigger picture,
100%.
especially, you know, with the statistics. And I imagine that those statistics are actually really underrepresented because, we know a lot of people are being diagnosed late, people are missed. I think it's something like 5% of people in eating disorder services have a diagnosis of being autistic. Up to 30% of people in eating disorder services absolutely mark up for autistic sort of characteristics or ways of being.
Mm.
I think this
Oh,
number is
yes.
way larger. I think it's 1 in 3 people in services are autistic if they have ARFID. I think if you have, I always get this the wrong way around. If you have ADHD, no, sorry, if you have binge eating disorder, you're 2.5 times more likely to have ADHD.
ADHD. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
To do the
I
other
mean,
way around.
all of
But
the,
the
yeah,
intersections are huge.
huge, huge, huge,
You cannot
huge.
work in eating disorders
Mm.
without understanding neurodivergence. And this is the message
Yeah.
I'm really trying to get out there.
Mm.
It's not a side note,
No,
it's a
no,
massive part of the picture. And it's just so
hugely.
refreshing to hear people like yourself, like really getting this.
Yeah. I think it's so, so important. The work that you're doing to create this awareness is so important. And I have to say, you're right. I'm surprised that those statistics are actually as low as they are, because I would expect them to
I
be
think
higher,
I think it's
given
to do with underdiagnosis. I imagine they
underdiagnosing,
are. They
probably.
are.
Yeah.
And there's just not
Because
been enough research done into it yet.
exactly. I have to say it's rare that I don't
Yeah,
find the neurodivergent sort of eating difficulties within an anorexic patient.
yeah.
And the same applies to my binge eating disorders, as you correctly said. I'm always got my sort of, radar up,
ADHD head on.
assessing
Yeah,
is there this executive function kind of issue? Is it the sensory stimulation that they're looking for? Because I see it so often, it's so prominent,
yeah,
so
massively, massively.
yeah.
I saw a post on LinkedIn the other day talking about working with anorexics. It was a therapist, and she was talking about the need for safety for people to sort of come in person, and then sort of said, but I appreciate, those of you who are neurodivergent informed, you may have a response to that. But what really confused me was like, how are you looking at these things as separate? Because
Absolutely.
she was almost saying like, with my clients who aren't neurodivergent, I'm like, are you not coming from the place of assuming that there is a massive correlation? Like, and then another person responded and saying, I work in eating disorders, I don't know that much about neurodivergence. And I was a bit
Mm,
like, what? This isn't a
yeah.
side note.
I'm just sort of thinking of a particular patient who was turned away from a day program because they couldn't sort of offer, foods that were sensory acceptable to her. So, and she's not a patient in isolation. I mean, she just happens to be on my caseload now. But this has happened so many times where, you know, these um, these boxes, if the patient doesn't fit a box, well, then they're turned away, or they seem to be treatment resistant, or no, we can't help you, we've got to discharge you.
Yeah,
And I think it is very often it's those neurodivergent
yeah,
traits which prevents a patient from accessing care.
yeah,
And it's just heartbreaking to see
yeah,
that somebody is being turned
absolutely.
away because the service hasn't quite adapted themselves to accommodate neurodivergent patients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been in recovery from anorexia for like well over 20 years now. And I would absolutely say without a shadow of a doubt, I still have half it. Um,
Yes.
that might not be
Yeah.
everyone's story, but they are two very, very different things. And,
Mm.
even to this day, yesterday, my daughter, I've got a thing about sauces, and my daughter was eating
Yeah.
something and there was tomato ketchup on the plate. I
Mm.
go near tomato ketchup and I literally start heaving in my mouth. And thankfully, another one of my kids, was happy to get it and put it in the dishwasher. I can't even go near the plate.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
got nothing to do with like body image or weight.
No. No.
Um, yeah,
No, not at all.
it's so
It,
important to understand this stuff. Finally, I'm so grateful for what you've said. If there was sort of a take home message, what's the one thing that you would want neurodivergent listeners, parents, or professionals to take away from this conversation?
think I would want people to take home the message that eating difficulties make sense if you take the time to actually understand the person. And if you understand the person, you will then understand they're not being difficult or non-compliant or treatment resistant or fussy. It's just about them trying to keep themselves safe,
Yeah,
and so to the patient out there, the neurodivergent patient, I would say you're not failing at nutrition. It's just that your needs haven't been understood.
yeah,
And to the parent out there, I would say, your child is not being fussy. It's just their way of coping when
yeah.
they refuse certain foods or they just can't tolerate certain foods.
Yeah, I think the thing that I probably haven't labelled really clearly is obviously we are talking about neurodivergence and the intersections, but actually how many eating disorders are also stemmed in, attachment difficulties, trauma,
Trauma,
and and have that all intersects with neurodivergence as well. But that
yes.
underneath all of these eating disorders, there is something much deeper going on. And sometimes on Facebook kind of groups, I will see things like my 12-year-old daughter is secretly eating at night and has gained lots of weight. Is there
Mm,
someone that can work with her to help her lose weight or to help her understand about
yeah,
healthy eating? And I think to myself, oh gosh, you are just totally missing the point. What is that binge eating
yeah,
serving? Why is she doing that?
exactly.
If we make this all about her weight and her shape, we're going to induce shame.
Hmm.
Eating disorders are so much deeper.
Deeper.
They're not just about a social media trend or because
Mhm.
somebody's seen a really thin model on a catwalk.
Exactly. I think it's one of the most common misunderstood things around eating disorders is that actually it's not about the food. The
Not at all.
food is
Yeah,
just a symptom of an underlying problem. And that sort of binging at night, secretive eating is obviously the young person's coping strategy to deal with something
yeah,
that's not sitting right. It could be social issues, trauma, it could be emotional issues, it could be relational issues, it could be feeling out of control
absolutely.
and needing to self-soothe. There's just so much
Yeah,
that could be triggering that behavior, which is that person's way of coping. And it's figuring out, well, what's actually the cause and how do we treat the cause? Because then the food behaviors often just
naturally.
resolve naturally. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I had to summarize our discussion today, I'd probably leave it with people as dig deeper,
Yes,
be curious and dig deeper.
exactly. I think it's about being curious, forget the judgment,
Yeah,
trying to understand behaviors from the context of the individual trying to cope is really important, and just be compassionate.
yeah, absolutely. Aleeza, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed having you. And yes, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.